You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Of all the objectives we seek, first and foremost is the establishment of lasting world peace. But let our friends and those who may wish us ill take note. The United States has an obligation to its citizens and to the people of the world never to let those who would destroy freedom dictate the future course of life on this planet.
Not doing it will be catastrophic. We'll have 8 degrees, we'll be 8 degrees hotter in 10, not 10, but in 30 or 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people who are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan, and living conditions will be intolerable. The droughts will be so bad there'll be no more corn growing. Not doing it is suicide. Just like dropping bombs on each other, nuclear weapons is suicide. So we've got to stop doing the two suicidal things, which are hanging on to our nuclear weapons
and global
and then after that we've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. But if there were less people, they'd be using less stuff.
Mr. Turner, I was wondering if you think it's a good idea to reduce 90% of the population because we are being overpopulated by a lot of... 90%. 80? Prince Philip said 80, sir. I go with 85.
I think 2 billion is about right.
Right, me too. Thank you.
One-child family.
Exactly. One-child policy.
Ken, can you speak about your population control, saying you want to reduce the population to 95%? Extermination? You said you want a one-child policy, but you have 5 kids. Doesn't make any sense.
The youngest one is 40 years old.
All right, but understand.
The world population then was 3 million.
But that's what the Nazis did with eugenics, sir. They wanted to destroy humanity.
Pay detail.
You don't got to tell you. I'm not even doing nothing wrong. Can you tell me what I did wrong?
You don't have permission here.
Yes, I do. I'm a legitimate person. I'm on the list, so I'm not even doing nothing illegal.
You talk to the management.
All right. Ted Turner, you're an enemy of humanity, and your Nazi-like policies won't be tolerated. I don't want to give you any trouble. I'm just trying to ask my questions, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm leaving, okay? Don't worry about that. Why do you want to destroy humanity, sir? You're an enemy of humanity.
Why do you support eugenics?
The Nazis support eugenics too. I'm on a public sidewalk and you cannot touch me. No, this is a public sidewalk. Get it. I'm just talking to him.
I got to step to the back.
So what'd you do at the Bilderberg group? That's where you decided your eugenics policies?
Why do you support depopulation, Ted?
Is it when the Bilderberg? Just like the Nazis did, exterminated the Jews with eugenics. You're doing the same thing nowadays, trying to exterminate the normal people.
Is 80% depopulation enough? Is 80% enough? 90%? And who's going to decide who lives and dies?
Be ashamed of yourself. You are not our leader. National sovereignty will prevail, and we will not have a new world order. We won't have a one world government. The elite won't be in charge because the people and national sovereignty will always prevail, sir.
Eugenics is no laughing matter, sir. Depopulation is no laughing matter.
Your silence shows complicity, sir.
Ted, who's going to decide who lives and dies over your eugenics population program?
You're no better than a Nazi. On leaving Microsoft, Bill Gates bought $23 million of Monsanto shares. Globally, he now promotes GMOs and a vaccines collection he calls the solution for the world. Gates has been recorded explaining this solution is actually to cut the world's population.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. The density in the poor areas is greater than they can grow the food. The benefits there in terms of reducing the population growth.
The only vaccines that reduce the population, notes the site Prison Planet, are ones that sterilize people. The BBC says his foundation's funding big sterilization programs such as this one that blasts men's scrotums with ultrasound to damage the sperm. Here, Gates actually calls for the so-called death panels to decide whether folks should live or whether, as he puts it, they have no benefit whatsoever.
And a lack of willingness to say, you know, is spending $1 million on that last 3 months of life for that patient, would it be better to see which ones actually have no benefit whatsoever? But that's called the death panel, and you're not supposed to have that discussion.
Anthony Gates actually brags he's doing God's work. The boss of Goldman Sachs said exactly the same thing while sending millions into starvation. What the heck is going on?
His father was one of the main grandfathers of the whole entire eugenics movement here inside the United States. And it's still going strong today.
My dad was head of Planned Parenthood, and it was very controversial.
And Bill Gates is here once again pushing the GMOs and everything else that is also reducing the population, because that's what he says. If we do a good enough job with vaccinations and everything, we'll be able to reduce the population. The polio vaccines now are the #1 cause of polio. There's no question that Bill Gates is not doing God's work. And if he is doing God's work, I would ask, which God?
Yeah, how have we moved to open plans to take away our water, hoarding food, and population controls?
They speak to us as if we are peon peasants in medieval times, and they are the kings, queens, and nobles. Why did they target the low-income portions?
Yeah, May 25th, over 2 million people across 48 states and 6 continents marched against Monsanto. What do you make of the company refusing to talk to us because we covered the march?
They can't stand up to the facts. They wouldn't come on this show. I would love to debate a Monsanto employee and show them that email. I mean, what would they say? They have nothing. They go into these poor communities and then, of course, reduced yields. So what happens to these farmers? They end up killing themselves by drinking the biopesticides that Monsanto gave them. So every 30 minutes, while we've been talking, someone has killed themselves.
Execs now boast about infertility from GMOs, hoard food, and say water shouldn't be a human right. Monsanto has publicly stated it wants to control 100% of the world's food supply. The government isn't stopping them, so who will?
$10 billion over the next 10 years to make it the year of the vaccines. What does that mean exactly?
Well, over this decade, we believe unbelievable progress can be made, both inventing new vaccines and making sure they get out to all the children who need them. We could cut the number of children who die every year from about 9 million to half of that if we have success on it. And the benefits there in terms of reducing sickness, reducing the population growth, it really allows a society a chance to take care of itself once you've made that intervention.
There's been a lot of scrutiny of vaccines recently, specifically childhood vaccines. There's been a lot of news about, is there a connection with autism, for example? What do you make of all that? Dr. Wakefield wrote a paper about this saying that he thought there was a connection. And there was lower vaccination rates as a result for a period of time in Britain than the United States. What are your thoughts?
Well, Dr. Wakefield has been shown used absolutely fraudulent data. He had a financial interest in some lawsuits. He created a fake paper. The journal allowed it to run. All the other studies were done, showed no connection whatsoever, again and again and again. And so it's an absolute lie that has killed thousands of kids, because the mothers who heard that lie, many of them didn't have their kids take either pertussis or measles vaccine, and their children are dead today. And so, the people who go and engage in those anti-vaccine efforts, they kill children. It's a very sad thing, because these vaccines are important.
Developing the vaccines, the scientific research that goes into that, obviously one thing, and then distributing things even after they've been created. Someone said to me once that even if the cure for HIV/AIDS came in the form of a clean glass of water, we still wouldn't get rid of AIDS in the world because of actually distributing some of these things. How do you address a challenge like that no matter the money?
Well, there are fantastic ways of getting vaccines out. That's a system that's been built up over the years. In the case of smallpox, they just used a vaccine and they eradicated the disease all the way back in 1979. We cover about 75% of the world's children with the vaccines. All you're doing is gathering women for the villages, getting them the vaccine and asking them to go around and find the children. And then you pay other people who are independent to come in, look at the children, survey, see what the coverage rate is. You also have clear indicators. Measles will always show you if somebody's not doing a good job on vaccination, kids will start dying of measles. And so we know when we spend money that the group we've asked to go do that vaccination, they've delivered.
You've talked about smallpox sort of being a little bit of a model in terms of proof of principle that it can be done. D.A. Henderson, Donald Henderson, who was with the World Health Organization at the time this was done, has said, look, when you talk about polio, is this more of a movement rather than a public health initiative using objective evidence? And I think what he was saying is that should this be more about annual immunizations rather than sort of trying to find this moment in time?
Well, when you talk to mothers whose children are paralyzed, I think no matter what you label it, it should be about getting rid of this evil disease. I don't think there's any philosophy that suggests having polio is a good thing. The world has been very careful to pick very few diseases for eradication because it is very tough. After smallpox got finished, the lesson from that was the miracle of vaccines, not that we should immediately take on other diseases.
You've talked about Afghanistan and Pakistan and the polio vaccine, and you've said that doing this, the vaccination campaign, can help stabilize a war-torn region like this.
What you're seeing is that the density in the poor areas is greater than they can grow the food, greater than they can educate, greater than they can provide the jobs. So you create these hot spots of instability. So even if all you care about is national security, these health things are a very cheap way to make sure you're not going to have turmoil that eventually would affect the whole world.
Is there a diplomatic part of this? I mean, the fact that your foundation, other organizations in partnership are doing this, is that part of it?
The general idea of the rich helping the poor, I think, is important. That your sense of justice says, why should rich kids who barely get these diseases and almost never die of them, why should they get the vaccines where poor kids who actually do die of these diseases don't get those things? It's a unbelievable inequity that there isn't that access. And it's been 15 years usually between when rich kids get vaccines and poor kids do.
There was an article about concerns about corruption and fraud with regard to the Global Fund. Do you expect just to have a certain amount of corruption and fraud? Just say, you know what, to do the work that we do, we have to expect and accept a certain amount of that?
Well, the Global Fund does a fantastic job. They've seen typically about 3 or 4% of the money they spend not be applied properly. So yes, you're going to have some, but it's fine. This is saving lives for well less than 1% of what you would spend in the rich world. And if you think lives are created equal, this says that, well, are they at least worth 1%? By and large, it's the one health intervention that can get to everyone. And fortunately, even though it's a few percent of the cost of most health things, over half of the lives saved by medicine come from vaccination. In fact, it's so simple, people often forget what a big deal this is. The 2 million people who'd be dying of smallpox now, they don't think, wow, I'm alive because of vaccination, but that's the case.
Yesterday, I ventured out to the University of Texas campus with fellow reporter David Ortiz, and we decided to infiltrate a closed Bill Gates speech. It was a tightly controlled situation. It had been a waiting list for months. We found a way to get inside, and I decided to go ahead and ask him a question. This special report actually premiered today on the radio, but we're going to go ahead and play that for you now. And it's actually up also on YouTube. It's entitled, Bill Gates Confronted on His Eugenics Vaccine Program That Has Crippled Nearly 50,000 Indian Children.
On a global basis, philanthropy in the United States is the envy of other countries because it's able to try out things innovative and diverse things, although with a very high failure rate, with enough of a success rate to really come up with big breakthroughs.
I'm Melissa Melton reporting for the InfoWars Nightly News. Multiple overseas media outlets have reported on the fact that polio vaccines linked to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and his Gavi Alliance have on record caused nearly 48,000 children in India to suffer neurological damage and become permanently paralyzed. Most recently, over 50 African children from Chad also began convulsing after receiving a Gates Foundation-funded meningitis vaccine that specifically targets African people. Those children, some as young as 7, have also subsequently become paralyzed. Yesterday, Bill Gates appeared at a highly controlled speaking engagement to address computer science majors at his new Bill and Melinda Gates Computer Science Complex building on the University of Texas campus. I was able to purchase a ticket from a student and attend the meeting. Though no cameras or recording equipment were allowed inside the meeting, fellow reporter David Ortiz was able to capture a live stream being fed to an adjacent room. When the floor got open for questions, I decided to ask Mr. Gates a real one.
Melissa Melton with InfoWars. What do you say to critics who claim your global vaccination program is nothing more than a eugenics program?
A huge...
Eugenics. Over 48,000 children in India have been paralyzed due to polio vaccines linked to your foundation.
No. I mean, nothing has saved more lives than vaccination. You know, the key figure that we think about in terms of what we're prioritizing is the tragic death of young people. But if you go back to about the time I was born, more than 20 million kids under 5 were dying every year. Smallpox, measles, a variety of things. By 1990, even though the number of children in the world, because the population growth had gone up, that number had come down from over 20 million to about 12 million. And because of the work that the foundation has been at the center of, we now got that down from 12 million to less than 7 million. And the goal is to get it down to well under 3 million, by which time the disparity between what happens with poor children and what happens with rich children will have largely been eliminated. So, you know, vaccines are about saving lives, improving lives. There's no better tool that mankind's ever invented for absolutely those things. And, you know, polio, the whole idea is to reduce to zero the number of kids who are being paralyzed. And it's during between now and 2018, if things go well, we expect that'll become the second disease ever eradicated. Smallpox back in the 1970s, by 1979, that was certified as the very first and so far the only disease that has been eradicated. So we're pretty close on polio, but what it's about is every year having less and less kids who either die or are paralyzed. Last year it was 232.
Not only did Bill Gates fail to directly answer my question, but let's review. Mr. Gates' father was a known eugenicist and the head of Planned Parenthood. He admits in this clip from a 2003 PBS interview with Bill Maher that he likes to focus on population control.
One issue that really grabbed me as urgent were issues related to population, reproductive health.
But did you come to reproductive issues as an intellectual?
When I was growing up, my parents were always involved in various volunteer things. My dad was head of Planned Parenthood, and it was very controversial to be involved with that.
He went on to say, and maybe the most interesting thing I learned is this thing that's still surprising when I tell other people, which is that as you improve health in a society, population growth goes down. In the past, Mr. Gates has openly advocated withholding end-of-life care to the elderly and using those funds to instead hire more teachers.
And so the access that used to be available to the middle class or whatever is just rapidly going away. That's a trade-off society is making because of very, very high medical costs and a lack of willingness to say, you know, is spending $1 million on that last 3 months of life for that patient, would it be better not to lay off those 10 teachers? That's called the death panel, and you're not supposed to have that discussion.
And he's also announced that the goal of vaccines is to reduce the population by 10 to 15%.
So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
So what does it matter if 48,000 children suffered permanent neurological damage and were paralyzed if it's in the name of philanthropy? But the problem is these vaccines have actually been shown to cause the very diseases they're supposed to prevent. Bill Gates is a billionaire technocrat obsessed with population control and the idea that vaccinating the world is doing, in his words, God's work. But who's God and at what cost? Trading lives for lives? What kind of world is that? When we devalue one human life, we devalue everyone's life. For InfoWars Nightly News, I'm Melissa Melton.
Polio, the whole idea is to reduce to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero.
And as you can see, Bill Gates never actually answered my question. He never addressed the fact that nearly 48,000 children in India, and that's just in India, other countries have had this problem with other vaccines of his foundation, but he never answered my question as to why they're being paralyzed. And his quote actually said there at the beginning of my report, philanthropy in the U.S. has other countries beat because we're able to try out innovative things, although with a very high failure rate, with enough of a success rate to come up with some big breakthroughs. So again, very high failure rate, but enough of a success rate we can have some breakthroughs. He's trading lives for lives. And they're spending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions, into these vaccines that are paralyzing and killing children all over the developing world. And I think it's interesting, investigative journalist Christina England says, why have major organizations spent $571 million on a vaccination project when wells to provide access to clean drinking water, something that could really change these people's lives, affect them all in a very positive way, have been constructed for less than $3,000 by the International Committee of the Red Cross. So they could spend chump change and just change these people's lives with fresh, clean drinking water that would change their lives, but instead he's spending hundreds of millions of dollars in vaccinations that are killing him. It's something to think about. So we need to get this video out to everyone so you can see that he will not address the fact that his vaccine programs are killing people. And by the way, some people like to mention that TED Talks, that the TED Talk he was talking about putting carbon emissions down. Yeah, this guy here, his speech is to say that the number needs to be zero is carbon emissions. I don't understand. Well, understand that we inhale oxygen and exhale carbon. Plants breathe carbon. If the plants die, we die, we're still dead. It's still population control. It doesn't matter which number gets to zero, we're going to die. That's what he meant, all right?
United Nations organizations are charged with sterilizing millions of girls and women under cover of an anti-tetanus vaccine program sponsored by the Kenyan government. The population control scheme was exposed after the Kenya Catholic Doctors Association sent 6 samples of the tetanus vaccine that was used during the World Health Organization's immunization campaign this year to laboratories in South Africa for testing. According to the doctors, all samples tested positive for the HCG antigen. HCG mimics a natural hormone that's produced by pregnant women. Well, the bishops and doctors warn that injecting women with HCG actually causes them to develop antibodies against it. When they do get pregnant and produce their own version of HCG, it triggers the production of antibodies that cause miscarriages. The doctors said, "This proved right our worst fears, that this World Health Organization campaign is not about eradicating neonatal tetanus, but a well-coordinated, forceful population control mass sterilization exercise using a proven fertility-regulating vaccine." Now that sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory until you read the World Health Organization's own literature. This is a report from August 1992 titled "Fertility Regulating Vaccines." In it, they discuss the most advanced research on FRVs involves vaccines directed against HCG. As the Kenyan doctors point out, World Health Organization conducted massive vaccination campaigns using the tetanus vaccine that was laced with HCG in Mexico in 1993 and Nicaragua and the Philippines in 1994. Just like with this current inoculation program in Kenya, these campaigns targeted women of childbearing age, 14 to 49 years old, and each received a total of 5 injections. A typical tetanus vaccine schedule is just 3 shots. And don't be fooled, this isn't about giving women around the world a choice. The tetanus laced with HCG was given as a fertility-regulating vaccine without disclosing its contraceptive effect to the young girls and mothers. Why would the UN want to suppress the population in developing countries?
The overlords of scientific dictatorship are ruthlessly prosecuting a war on our most defenseless. In December of 1974, the U.S. government made Third World population reduction a central national security issue. The operation plan, titled National Security Study Memorandum 200, openly stated that populous Third World nations posed a threat to the international elite's monopoly of global power. The Kissinger-authored U.S. plan targeted 13 key countries where massive population reduction was called for. Kissinger recommended that IMF and World Bank loans be given on condition that nations initiate aggressive population control programs, such as sterilization. Kissinger also recommended that food be used as a weapon, and that instigating wars was also a helpful tool in reducing population. In 1972, the Nixon White House also implemented a eugenics policy, which was directed by George Herbert Walker Bush, then United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Bush advised China on the formulation of their one-child policy and directed the federal government to forcibly sterilize more than 40% of Native American women on reservations.
And following in his eugenicist father's footsteps, Bill Gates donates millions of dollars to research population control programs.
Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to 0. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is committing $10 billion over the next 10 years to make it the most aggressive decade ever, rolling out new vaccines to poor nations around the world. This idea of population control has been around for decades and probably much longer. It's backed by powerful economic interests to cull the world population of the useless feeders so corporate giants can exploit world resources unimpeded.
You know what they put in the water, don't you? Fluoride, on the pretext that it strengthens your teeth. That's ridiculous.